program here at the refuge to help raise funds for this fantastic new visitor center that you're enjoying. And we raised a few $1,000s. I gave a program called Sanibel BC. Sanibel before the Causeway. Today's program is a little bit different than that original program because I'll be bringing in a lot of lighthouse history, factual things about the Sanibel Lighthouse that are basically forgotten in most accounts. First of all, my name is Charles LaBeouf. I first came to Sanibel in 1952. I moved back here permanently in 1958. For 22 years, I lived at the Sanibel Lighthouse. I formed an organization called Coretta Research, a sea turtle conservation group on the island, and I served 6 years on the original Sanibel City Council. And so with that background, you should now be generating questions about what happened to Sanibel. How come it's developed so much? We can go to the Causeway if you wish to, but that's sort of a hot potato, but I'll go there if we need to. So at this point, I'll be starting the slide shortly. However, we will have these intermissions, so if you feel you have to leave the auditorium, please leave the auditorium at one of those intermissions. So if we could have the lights off, please, and we'll get the... Could I have the lights back on a minute? And some of the things I've produced through the years. This book, Sanibel Light, is a history of Sanibel. It was published in 1998. Much of the information that I'll be talking about this afternoon is also in this book. An earlier book that deals with the biology and conservation of loggerhead turtles is one that I published in 1990, pardon me. This book and Sanibel Light are both available in the gift shop here at the refuge. My latest book, just released the day before Christmas, is The Calusan. It's a novel about early Sanibel. In 1883, a young Florida cracker cowboy comes to Sanibel and discovers a gold coin. And this book follows that coin through 4 centuries, unraveling a mystery of how the coin came to arrive on Sanibel. It deals a great deal in archaeology, and the most important part of the book is a fairly accurate account of the Calusa Indians' conflict with the conquistador Ponce de Leon. So this is available in all island bookshops. Since it's a novel, it is not sold here at the gift shop. I do have a few copies with me if anyone's interested in an autographed copy. Now we'll have the light. This is a shot of a Sanibel sunrise. Most people are into taking photographs of Sanibel sunsets, but during my time at the lighthouse, one year I tried to photograph 365 sunrises, but alas, it didn't work. I'll be using a laser pointer this afternoon, pointing out things, and I'll try to draw your attention to it by turning it in a circle. This is an aerial photograph taken in 1996. It's one of the most complete composite photographs of Sanibel, most of Captiva, Buck Key, Pine Island. The lighthouse point is here. The causeway is located here. Tarpon Bay, the wildlife drive through Ding Darling Refuge. This is the Gulf Front Ridge I'll be speaking about, and this is the Mid-Island Ridge that separates the mangrove forest of the refuge from the freshwater wetlands of the interior of Sanibel that is known as the Sanibel Slough. Today it's more commonly called the Sanibel River. Ponce de Leon first visited southwest Florida, and most historians feel that he landed on the shore of San Carlos Bay in May of 1513. And this is the west coast of Florida as Ponce de Leon saw it. A high canopy of cabbage palms, an understory of sea grapes, sea oats, no exotic plants, no Australian pines, no Brazilian pepper, just a beautiful, wild beach in all of its splendor. Of course, Ponce de Leon was enraptured by Southwest Florida. He came back in 1521. He was again met by bands of Calusa Indians. This time they united as one great group, fought the Spanish, and in those battles Ponce de Leon was mortally wounded and later died in Havana, Cuba. I threw this slide in the other day because it goes back to some of my early work. I started with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 1956 as a fishery technician. I worked on the red tide research that was being conducted in Naples. We had a field station there back in those days. And this is a red tide that occurred in 1971. This was the worst red tide that I had ever encountered. This is a shot taken down at the Lighthouse Point looking up towards the Sanibel Causeway. When a red tide occurs, it's caused by a microscopic organism. Some taxonomists call it a algae, some call it a dinoflagellate. My training, back when I was trained in the red tide aspects of local marine biology, we classified it as a dinoflagellate, a one-celled animal that was commonplace offshore, but under certain conditions, no one really knew what those conditions were. Specifically, this little organism would bloom, it would release a neurotoxin, the neurotoxin would affect the breathing apparatus of fish, the fish would die and wash in on the beach in countless trillions. And these are mostly bottom fish like spiny boxfish, mullet, but from the smallest fish to the greatest sized Goliath sea bass, they all washed in on the beach. Down at the rocks, which is about midway, a little more westerly of Midway than the center of Sanibel, 30, 40-pound snook, one of our prime game fish, washed up on the beach by the thousands. It was just unbelievable. And I should point out there's a lot of information about manatee mortality related to red tide. This red tide in 1971 reached further up the Caloosahatchee than any previous red tide. It infiltrated all the bay and the sound and all of the creeks and the tidal system, yet there was no manatee mortality. That's just an interesting aspect of perhaps some relationship between the two. And much of my life was devoted to loggerhead turtle conservation. The loggerhead is up to a 400-pound marine turtle that congregates offshore and comes on these beaches to nest. This is a female loggerhead in the process of laying eggs. When I first came to Sanibel in 1952, I came by ferry. You'll see the original ferry that I came on in a later shot. This is a steel-hulled ferry. Kinsey Brother Ferry Line had 4 ferries at the height of its operation. But I have this slide to point out an interesting fact that has long since vanished. This tower here is the front range light at the port of Punta Rassa. Punta Rassa, where the toll plaza is located, in the 1860s to the early 1900s was a bustling cattle port. Up to 25,000 head of cattle were transported out of Port Punta Rassa to Cuba and a few of the French islands during that period. And the lighthouse was erected in 1884, and within 10 years, the other port improvements were put in place, including the front range, and then behind that, on the shore of Fisherman Key, this key, the rear range was located. So when a person that was navigating coming to the port of Punta Rassa was offshore, he would pick up the Sanibel light, which was a landfall light. He would go to his chart and with a stopwatch time the characteristic of the Sanibel light, which was a flash every 2 minutes. So he would find on his chart that the Sanibel light had a 2-minute interval flash. He would begin steaming or sailing inshore towards the light. He would pick up a sea buoy off of the Sanibel light about 2.5 miles to the southeast, come in towards that, and then he would pick up the front range. He would align the light of the front range with the light of the rear range, and that would bring him in a straight, clear-cut channel into the port of Punta Rassa. So those were state-of-the-art aids to navigation in 1904, 100 years ago. This is the Islander. This is the ferry that I rode to Sanibel on the first time. It was a wooden hulled. 3 of the ferries carried 9 cars. One ferry, the best, only carried 8 cars. A round trip to Sanibel for my wife, my daughter, and I was $4. It was much more expensive than the Causeway. Therefore, we went to town once a month to get haircuts, visit doctors, dentists, do a little grocery shopping, perhaps even see a movie. This is the eastern end of Sanibel before the Causeway, the lighthouse point, the original Coast Guard pier that was turned into a fishing pier. The new Sanibel pier is located about 300 feet west of that site, right about in there. This is a basin in between the buildings at Lighthouse Point Condominium. It was actually a little yacht basin. The seawalls are still there, and Kinsey used that for his boat basin for small boats. Sanibel is reasonably undeveloped. There is no Shell Harbor. There is no dunes or gumbo limbo, and very little development is visible to the west of this area by Causeway or east of Causeway. The Sanibel Lighthouse, this is a poor slide, but it gives you an idea of the size of the lens, and I'll be touching on that a little bit later. This shot is from 1950. It's not a very good slide. This ferry is leaving Sanibel, headed towards Punta Rassa. This is the Rebel, one of the steel-hulled boats. When the Causeway came in on May 26, 1963, Kinsey had sold out his franchise to Lee County for the boats. The 2 wooden-hulled vessels were in not so good condition, so they were sort of scuttled, but the 2 steel boats, one ended up in Put-in Bay, Ohio, and the other ended up in Brazil. This is the Sanibel ferry landing. As it was when I first came to Sanibel, we had just the one slip. In Sanibel, the shoreline is much different than it is today. The Australian pines were really just getting established in the early or the late 50s. The landscape was more grassland than it is today. There was no encroachment of Brazilian peppers that virtually wiped out the grasslands. This is basically the death scene of the Sanibel ferry. The causeway is in place. The drawbridge is open. You can see each half is open. And there are 2 slips. There's one ferry unloading, one ferry loading, and one standing by offshore to unload. And I believe that one's the best because there is no superstructure on it like these 2. This sign was a welcome sign to the Sanibel National Wildlife Refuge. In 1945, President Harry Truman proclaimed that all of Sanibel and some of the intracoastal waterway would become the Sanibel National Wildlife Refuge. Ding Darling was one of the chief advocates of establishing a national wildlife refuge here. And after his passing in 1962, a group of people got together, formed the Ding Darling Memorial Committee, and pushed the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Department of the Interior, to rename the refuge, and in 1967 it was renamed in honor of Ding Darling, its present name. Our mail and most of our produce and ice and other commodities that weren't always brought over on ferries came by mailboat. This is the mailboat, the Santiva, that is arriving at the dock to unload mail and passengers. This is the route of the mailboat. The mail came over 6 days a week. People would buy a ticket at the Fort Myers Yacht Basin, get on board the mailboat for a day's excursion to the Barrier Islands. They would come down the Caloosahatchee, come down to Bailey's Dock on Sanibel, unload the mail. Some folks would get off the mailboat, take their picnic lunches, go down Bailey Road and end up on the beach and spend 4 or 5 hours shelling on the beach. It was a great way to get to the islands. For those that stayed on the mailboat, they would then they'd get here about 10:30, and at about 11 they'd leave and go over to St. James City on Pine Island. They'd unload the mail, take on mail, then go up the Intercoastal Waterway to Captiva, just about where the Green Flash restaurant is located now. They'd do the same thing there, and then they'd backtrack and get back to Fort Myers in the evening. It was a great way to visit the Barrier Islands. And many people who visited Sanibel, that's the only way they ever came here. This is Bailey's General Store in 1959, located on the bay. This building has since been donated by the Bailey family to the city of Sanibel, and it's located at the Sanibel Historical Village. If you haven't been there, by all means, make it a point to visit it. It's very well done. They have some nice exhibits, and some of the older buildings are still standing. This is the mailboat dock. This building was a little storage building. There were gas pumps out on the dock, and this was a sort of a recreation area. I remember as a young adult diving off of the top of this building into the water. It was just a great place for everyone to get together on Sundays and meet friends and do some swimming. I should point out that when I came here, there were just about 400 permanent residents. I registered to vote in 1960. I was the 155th registered voter. Of course, the election that year was a very heated election, so by the time in November rolled around, there were probably 1,000 registered voters. This is the Algiers. Some of you may remember this. This was in place until about roughly 1980. A family by the name of Browns bought a piece of property on Sanibel where the Gulf Shore Park is located now, down Algiers Road that goes off of Causeway Road. And these people were quite wealthy, and they bought an old ferry, Mississippi River ferry, that ran from New Orleans to Algiers. They brought it to Fort Myers and had it retrofitted into something that looked like an old Mississippi paddle wheel. The paddle wheel is here. This gentleman was a prominent person by the name of Brown. He was actually best man at FDR's wedding, so he was quite an influential person. They renovated it into a palatial home. Then they had a canal dug from the Gulf Beach up to the piece of property, and they floated this boat in, jacked it up, filled under it. They did have a reflecting pool at the paddle wheel end, and it was quite an elaborate building. Before it was completed in 1960, Mr. Brown died. Mrs. Brown went back to California, and as far as I know, she never came back to Sanibel. And the city of Sanibel acquired it from the Brown estate, roughly 78 to 80, somewhere in that period. But by that time, the Algiers was in such disrepair that it wasn't safe to use it for a museum. That was one of the first things we were going to do with it. So it was raised, and it's now just a beachfront park. This is Tarpon Bay before Hurricane Donna in 1960. This is where the refuge concession is now located. And if you stand down at Tarpon Bay on the observation deck and look over to your right, you'll see some pilings that are sticking up. And this is the building that was sitting on those pilings. It's an old packing house where Sanibel vegetables were transported to the eastern markets. I always loved this building because we could take one of these skiffs and paddle out there, and there were 5 rooms in this building. All the windows and doors were off by this time, and we had 5 families of barn owls that lived in the building. Hurricane Donna came along and took the building out. The only thing left is the pilings. The Wildlife Drive was started in 1965, and this is a shot of the drag line that's digging it. This is just beyond the tower where the drive makes a left-hand turn. This is about where the drag line is operating. Colin Moore, who worked for the Lee County Mosquito Control District, went out one side, then came back down the other and created the Wildlife Drive. I'll touch on why a little bit later. This is Colin standing beside his drag line. Of course, the mangrove habitat is very harsh, very muddy, so they had to put these large timber mats down so the machine could crawl out on them and not sink into the mud. But Colin was a real technician with the drag line, and he basically single-handedly built the entire drive. This is Sanibel. This is a plat map from 1833. You notice Sanibel is spelled with a Y instead of an I, and that's why I use Sanibel Light as the title of my book. This is the original English spelling of Sanibel. Sanibel spelled this way was used, as far as I have found, as recently as 1898 in a scientific document. The word with the I came into being about 1862 on some of the charts just during the Civil War period. A group of New York investors bought title to Sanibel from a person who had acquired a large Spanish land grant from the King of Spain. The title was always in question, but they platted it into long lots that ran from the bay into the Gulf, and they developed a little town site with parks. This dark area here is the mouth of the Sanibel River, and I'll touch on that later. They colonized it by 1834, but by 1836 they were all gone. The Second Seminole War had started. The U.S. Army moved settlers off the coastal islands because of the fear of Indian engagement. And of course, the harsh environment, the mosquitoes and the hurricanes, were factors that these new settlers really couldn't cope with. So by 1838, Sanibel was deserted. The early settlers had a smart idea. They thought if their little settlement was to thrive, they would have to have some type of commerce. So they noted on their plat, intended site for a lighthouse. And by 1834, they had petitioned the U.S. lighthouse establishment up in Washington to build a lighthouse on the eastern tip of Sanibel. Today we know it as Point Bell or Lighthouse Point. The Lighthouse Board denied the request, but every so often people would apply to the Lighthouse Board asking for a lighthouse. They knew that it would eventually be needed if they were to have any kind of commercial center in the area. This is a chart from 1860. Fort Delaney is Punarassa. Fort Delaney was established during the Second Seminole War. Sanibel Island, still spelled with a Y. Captiva Island, Pine Island. Cayo Costa was known as La Costa. And of course, Captiva was all one island. There was no Captiva and Upper or North Captiva in the 1860s. This is one of the earliest aerials of Sanibel that I found. This is from a 1936 aerial photograph, a postcard advertising Island Inn. Sanibel Island is marked, but it gives us a good feel for what a more primitive Sanibel Island looked like. The Lighthouse Point, Periwinkle Way, Tarpon Bay. The white areas are the Sanibel Sand Flats. The Visitor Center is located right about in here. You can see this dark line that I pointed out on the plat as the Sanibel River, Periwinkle Way. This dark area here, and some of this are the Australian pines that were brought here by the Bailey family in the 1920s to decorate, make Periwinkle Way a more attractive drive. Little did anyone know what damage they would cause the environment a half-century later. This is an 1844 aerial of Sanibel. You can see the Australian pines, the dark area of the Sanibel River. You can see that Sanibel is nothing but a front after front of ridges and then depressions or swales, just line after line of old beach fronts. So Sanibel grew from these areas seaward with subsequent hurricanes and formed all of these basins. The largest basin is the main part of the Sanibel Slough. This is Tarpon Bay Road, of course Bailey Road. The Causeway comes in right about in here. This is the eastern end of Sanibel in 1960. People through the 1850s, 60s, and 70s kept applying for a lighthouse. And by 1883, the port of Punta had grown to be so important for especially cattlemen and farm produce that the Lighthouse Board agreed to build the lighthouse. They had selected two sites. One was Bowditch Point on the north end of Fort Myers Beach, and one was Point Bell, or East Point on Sanibel Island. They picked Sanibel Island and they commenced to design a lighthouse and check on property rights. They found out that in 1845, when Florida entered the Union, that most of the lowlands on the islands under the Swamp and Overflowed Lands Act was conveyed to the state of Florida. So the federal government owned no land on eastern Sanibel on which to build a lighthouse. So they began a process and applied to the state to relinquish title to state lands on Sanibel. And the state agreed. All of the land on Sanibel was released to the federal government, and all of Sanibel Island was then established as the Sanibel Island Lighthouse Reservation. And the lighthouse construction began in March of 1884. By 1888, the Lighthouse Board felt they didn't need all of Sanibel. So everything on Sanibel, all of the land on Sanibel, except some of the original public domain lands that were not in state title prior to 1883, were homesteaded off under the Homestead Act. You could go to the land agent and apply for 160 acres of land on Sanibel, and if you agreed to live on the land or farm it for 5 years, you would be given title to the 160-acre tract. So everything to the west of Bailey Road and Beach Road was homesteaded off. As farming came on, Sanibel was basically clear-cut. Every bit of high ground where tomatoes, squash, peppers could be grown, the trees, it was denuded. It was completely cut down to the topsoil. And farming became very productive. And then in 1923, the Lighthouse Service then again decided they didn't need all of this land. So everything between Bailey Road and a point 1,000 feet west of the lighthouse was proclaimed surplus, and that was sold off in 15 and 20-acre tracts of land. And then in 1926, along came a major hurricane. It took out the cattle docks for about the third time at Punta Rasa. It washed over all of Sanibel except for one 13-foot high piece of property on West Gulf Drive. And the soil on Sanibel was flooded by salt water and basically ruined. So farmers could never recover. They started to go under. And some families who had gained enough capital in their operations on Sanibel began to buy up the homestead parcels of those farmers that had gone broke. So a few families acquired large parcels of land. For example, the Bailey family acquired large tracts of land during that period. So Sanibel settled from a farming community to a lazy, sleepy community through the 30s. And after World War II, it began to grow. And we now have something like 6,500 permanent residents, somewhere in that vicinity. Sanibel has a build-out plan where some little over 7,000 dwelling units will be permitted to be built here, and that's supposed to be the cap. Time will tell how strong our politicians are. This is the eastern end of Sanibel to give you an idea of how it's changed. This is from 1996. The Causeway, Lighthouse Point, Sanibel Estates, and this is the large development that the person who pushed for the Causeway, Hugo Lindgren, after he tied in the Causeway, he then acquired all of this land for the Shell Harbor Division. Originally, the county had planned to bring in the Causeway to tie in to Bailey Road, but like many of us who lived on the island at the time, Francis Bailey, who controlled the Bailey properties on Sanibel, was against the Causeway. We fought as hard as we could to prevent the Causeway from coming in. And in a last-ditch effort, Francis Bailey blocked the county from the right-of-way to tie into Bailey Road, but the kind-hearted Hugo Lindgren deeded the right-of-way and was gracious and gave the Chamber of Commerce the property where their building is located. And of course, Lindgren went on, not only did he develop Shell Harbor, but he developed the Beachview Golf Course. This is the Sanibel Lighthouse from about 1900. When I moved here in 1958, my wife, daughter, and I moved into this house, and we lived in that house for just a few months shy of 22 years. And the reason I moved there, this was the headquarters for the Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge, then the Sanibel Refuge. The refuge manager, Tommy Wood, lived in this house. The office was located in one of the bedrooms. And back when this was taken in 1900, the light was operated by the Lighthouse Service, and the light keepers had put up the curtains around the lamp room so that the sunlight would not damage the very expensive Fresnel lens that was located in there. And this is how the light was maintained from 1884, when it came online on August 20th, 1884. It was lit for the first time. In 1939, the U.S. Coast Guard took over the lighthouse operations from the Lighthouse Service, and the Coast Guard maintained the light with resident light keepers until 1949. In 48, a severe hurricane did a lot of damage to this house. The Coast Guard feared it would wash away, so they announced that the Sanibel light was automated, and the Coast Guard personnel left and moved upriver to Fort Myers. The Fish and Wildlife Service in April of 1949 then applied to the Coast Guard for an agreement to manage the lighthouse point, and the Fish and Wildlife Service personnel moved into the light. You can see there's very little vegetation, mostly low buttonwoods and a few cabbage palms in 1900. This is a sister light to the Sanibel light. I put this in just to give you some little impact of what can happen. This is the Brazos River Light, which was located 50 miles south of Corpus Christi, Texas. The great hurricane, the Galveston hurricane, basically demolished this light station. It took out this building. It's almost totally taken out. It's the exact configuration of the Sanibel light. The light tower survived. Considerable damage was done here. But this was totally destroyed, and the lighthouse service took out the buildings, and they moved the lighthouse to another location further west on the Gulf Coast. Further east on the Gulf Coast. Many folks can't see inside the Sanibel Lighthouse, so I'll give you a little tour of what things look like. The Sanibel Light is classified as a pyramidal structure. It's made out of wrought iron. It's not steel. It's not cast iron. There's some books, even my own, Sanibel Light, give an inaccurate step count. The actual step count, once you're inside the light, is 105 steps. The 127 steps that I give in Sanibel Light were the steps from ground level to the lantern room. But the actual count is 105 treads, cast iron treads, that are locked into this center pipe. This is looking up from the landing inside the lighthouse. It's all painted white. It's kept in real nice condition. The lighthouse is normally sandblasted and repainted every 12 years by the Coast Guard. It's in excellent condition for its nearly 120 years of age. This is looking down the stairs from the watch room. The stairs are extremely tight near the top. It's almost like a step ladder. This floor here is the floor of the watch room. This is the windowless area between under the lantern room, and there's just a pair of doors that open up to the gallery that goes all the way around the lighthouse. This is the clockworks, a clockworks that's very similar to the one that operated in the Sanibel Light. This photograph was taken in a sister light of the Sanibel Light, the Cape San Blas light up on the Florida Panhandle. There was an immaculate clockwork similar to the clock in a clock bell tower. The light keeper, every 2 hours, would put in a crank and crank the clockworks, and a counterweight down inside that center tube would be elevated to a location and then disengaged, and it would slowly rotate the lens. The gears on the top of this would mesh with the gears in the light pedestal. This is the light pedestal. The gear works. This is the Sanibel pedestal. This pinion gear would mesh with gears in that clockworks. This is a ball bearing assembly. The lubricant is still in there. The lubricant is mercury. You can just touch one of these bars and just give it a little push, and that thing will still turn. It's really remarkable how well tuned it is. The lens, the original lens that we saw a blurry shot of, was a third order Fresnel lens. It was 5.5 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter. It had a series of prisms ground in the focal plane. And as the clockworks turned this gear, turned this ring, and that turned the lens. In the center of that was a kerosene lantern, not much different than what we use as a storm lantern today. And it was lit by the lighthouse keeper. And as this lens turned around, this 11,000 candle power lantern, as one of these prisms came into your line of vision, whether you were on land or offshore, whenever this prism came into your line of sight, it intensified the illumination to 44,000 candle power, and that gave you a flash. And that flashed every 2 minutes, giving it its characteristic. The original lens was in there from 1883 until 1923. The fuel was kerosene. That's why that little oil house is located down at the base of the lighthouse. In 1923, they tried an experimental fuel. They brought in acetylene gas. There were very few acetylene lanterns in the lighthouse service, but it worked. It proved to be okay for the Sanibel Light. And they took out that first lens and put in a fixed lens that had a prism 360 degrees. And whenever the burner, which was operated by a pilot light inside the center of that lens, fired, it would produce a flash that was changed to a two flash increment. A flash back in 1923 of a 3 seconds and then a 7-second flash. In other words, it would flash, 3 seconds of dark flash, 7 seconds of dark flash, 3 seconds flash, and so on through the night. In 1962, with the Causeway coming online very shortly, the Coast Guard decided they would electrify the Sanibel lighthouse. So I helped take out that second, third order lens and put in a drum lens, 500 millimeter drum lens that is now located at the Sanibel Historical Village. And then about 1982, 83, they changed the lens to just a simple airport beacon that is basically on a two-sequence flash, not quite as precise as the original light keepers kept it. The lighthouse is still functioning. They tried to extinguish it back in about 1976, but people on the island raised Cain, and the Coast Guard still operates the lighthouse. As an aid to navigation, it's virtually useless. You can be 5 miles offshore, and because of the sky glow in Cape Coral, lights on Fort Myers Beach and Sanibel, you really can't find it. However, it's still being operated by the Coast Guard. This is the lighthouse in 1933. You can see that enormous third-order lens. This is the second lens. Australian pines were just being cultivated. These are kept nice and trim by the lighthouse personnel. A concrete walk runs from the bay to the oil house, and then it wide off to each house. This is the lighthouse point just about the time that, about a month before I moved into it. I moved into this house. High tide would come up under the house. The spring tide would come up where this rack line is here. I've actually stood right there on the back porch of that house, and with a cast net filled my net with mullet.
Oh, wow.
I've taken a number 18M mirror lure and caught 25-pound snook. So the erosion was quite severe. The cistern that was originally located here, you'll see in a few minutes, was washed out in '48. This cistern on this building is still here. There's a little tower right here, a little cottage right in here. This is a boathouse down by the pier. This shot is from 1949. The enormous lens is still in place. The Coast Guard had left. They'd boarded up quarters to the house that I moved into. This is a septic tank. Cabbage palm is dead because of erosion. And here's this little tower that I mentioned, the little white building. The Australian pines are tiny compared to what they are today. Today they're way up in here. At the outbreak of World War II, the Coast Guard established a series of beach patrols and staffed areas to protect ports. And Port Punarasa was still classified as a port, so they assigned a contingent of Coast Guardsmen to protect Sanibel and Port Punarasa from U-boat landings, saboteurs landing on the coast, German U-boats. So this new division of the Coast Guard applied to the Aids to Navigation Division and asked if they could use one of the buildings to bivouac their personnel and use the lighthouse as an observation point to look for German submarines. But bureaucracies being what they are, the Coast Guard turned down the request but said you can use the land. So they built a 35-foot-high tower to look for German U-boats, and they built this little two-bedroom cottage to bivouac their troops. So throughout, from 1942 until 1945, Coast Guard personnel patrolled the Sanibel beach by jeep, and they did watch inside this little tower looking for U-boats. Needless to say, no U-boats were found. Rumor says that a German U-boat was sunk off of Boca Grande, north of here, but I've never seen any documentation that actually happened. This is quarters 2, my house, that I moved into in '58. This was taken in the 30s when the cistern was still in existence. When I moved into this house, the drinking water that I had fell from the skies. It fell on the roof, into gutters, down downspouts, into a 5,000-gallon cistern. Not this one, but the one on the other house is what I used. Originally, a pipe went into the kitchen. The wings were the original kitchens of the buildings. And originally, there was a breezeway that ran from the kitchen, between the kitchen and the main part of the house. This little area here was the privy, the outhouse, the toilet. There was a wooden chute that went down to the ground, and that was the only restroom they had there from 1884 until 1923, when a storeroom was converted into a bathroom. But I drank rainwater from 1958 until just before 1966. We had a problem with the water. We still use the cistern for showers and things like that, but drinking water, we started using bottled water. And then in 1966, the Island Water Association was formed, and water was piped all over Sanibel, Captiva. That's what we drink today. I see people today, I was at Bailey's, going to this little water dispenser they have to buy their water. I mean, that's the same water that everyone else drinks. The only thing is it runs through a little machine. All you have to do with this water, if you don't like the taste, is put it in a container and let it aerate overnight, and it tastes perfectly fine. This is the lighthouse looking from the bay side. This is a 5,000-gallon cistern that was on the ground. Originally, this was used for emergency water, for fire protection, or for watering plants or bathing. There were 2 water towers between the houses, and one of these was water that was pumped from the cisterns for gravity feed to the houses after 1923, and one was a brackish water tank. You can see part of it right there, where brackish water from the groundwater aquifer was pumped up and then gravity fed to each toilet, so that brackish water flushed the toilets. Originally, stairways went from the lighthouse up to the landing inside the tube. The lighthouse keepers would have to fill their oil containers in the oil house, walk up the stairs, across the deck, up these stairs, and then the steps up to the lantern room to fill the lighthouse with fuel oil, kerosene. These turnbuckles here are now covered with sand. The elevation now at the lighthouse is about 6 feet above mean sea level. The bottom of this tube is 25 feet above sea level. These main beams are 11.5 feet above mean sea level. Hurricane Donna, which was our most recent severe hurricane, occurred September 10th, 1960, and Donna put up just a few inches shy of a 9-foot tide. There was 3 feet of water running over this point. I was ordered to evacuate in advance, and my wife, daughter, and I went to Naples. We actually went from the fire pan into the fire. We went to my folks' home to spend the storm. The flood of record, the most serious severe hurricane, occurred in 1873, 11 years before these buildings were put up. This deck on the porches is 13.5 feet above mean sea level. The flood of record put a 14-foot tide up at Punta Rassa. That means the water would have been running across the lighthouse point this deep, and had these houses been here, of course, they would have been taken out by the surge. So that's something those of us who live on Sanibel have to look forward to. It will come again. We'll someday get a 20-foot storm surge that will not only take out these buildings, it will take out all of the other low-lying buildings along the water's edge. When Sanibel incorporated in 1974, one of the first things we did was endorse and accept the federal flood regulations. So all new houses that came in after we passed the comprehensive land use plan in 1976 had to be built with their first habitable floor 12.5 feet above mean sea level. That's why all of these new houses are built at a higher elevation. And one thing we also did that's important, that those of you who have only been here a few years should know, that before 1974 we were under Lee County zoning standards. The Lee County Commission was allowing buildings to be built on Sanibel within 25 feet of mean high water, right out on the beach. They were allowing buildings to come in at 44 units per acre. The first thing we did was drop that density down to 5 units per acre. So even though you see a lot of recent condominiums, they're built at that lower density. Imagine what this place would be like if we hadn't done that, or if we hadn't put a building height cap on. We would have 20-story buildings on Sanibel now. You think the traffic's bad now? Think of what it could have been had we not done that. This is the lighthouse point at about the height of the erosion. This is when the tide came up under the buildings. This was taken in 1950. And when I came here, I had to use a plank to go across to the first step to get up in the house. And these stairs were taken out in 1952. They basically rotted away. In 1959, we had a storm that snuck in on us. In June of 1959, this is my daughter, Leslie, who just turned 45, and her aunt. This is when a storm came up and flooded the lighthouse point. They're standing in salt water. This metal tank replaced that wooden cistern we saw in an earlier slide. This is where we got our water for showering. Over the years, there's been a serious erosion problem at the lighthouse point, and a more serious problem up on Captiva. But after about 1970, Captiva began to erode at an accelerated rate, and Captiva sand ended up on Sanibel, and eastern Sanibel began to grow. This is 1972. This is 1982. The land had completely filled in, vegetated in. Now you can stand down on the water's edge at the lighthouse, and unfortunately you can't see the lighthouse. That's because of the city of Sanibel, who now manages the lighthouse point, has gone overboard with their native vegetation protection, and they don't do any maintenance around the lighthouse. Originally, the lighthouse compound was nearly 300 feet long and like 190 feet in width, and that was kept basically bare of vegetation, with the exception of some coconut palms that we use for landscaping. And the reason for that was fire protection. If fire got into these buildings, they're made primarily out of pine, they would be gone in 10 minutes, long before our local fire department could get there. These places would be gone. And all it would take today, with the way the city has allowed the vegetation to grow up next to those houses, would be one cigarette, one lightning flash, and our beautiful Sanibel Lighthouse buildings would be gone. This is a sore point that I have. I just need to spread the word. Of course, I'm not doing anything about it, but telling people about it. Maybe someone will. I'm no longer a political animal. This is the drum lens that is now located at the Sanibel Historical Village. This is the Sanibel Slough in 1950. The Bailey Tract, I'm sure you're all familiar with that. These pine trees are some of the originals that were planted as landscape plants out on the beach. There was a road that ran from Causeway to Island Inn, and the Bailey family and other people planted these pines to decorate that original Gulf Drive. And from that source, and the source on Periwinkle Way, the Australian pines have really taken over, and it's classified now as a pest plant. That road where those trees are growing was taken out in Hurricane Donna. It's no longer there. This is the bottom of the Sanibel Slough. It went completely dry by late spring, and when it went dry, we had no fresh water on Sanibel for wildlife. In the wintertime, after the rainy season ended in September, we had plenty of water until about March. And Sanibel was a wonderful place. It attracted countless numbers of migratory birds and migratory waterfowl. Our duck counts were really up in high numbers. But without any permanent fresh water, the resident wildlife, the colonial birds, had no fresh water. Alligators had no fresh water. Frogs had no fresh water. There were no freshwater fish here to speak of, except some small minnows and a few garfish. So to create fresh water on Sanibel, one of the early management schemes was to blast potholes, and this is the Sanibel Big Bang. This is 225 sticks of dynamite in the Bailey Tract, going sky high, mud going everywhere. What goes up must come down. Came back down in the hole, but it did leave a pothole. You can see how nice and grassy the Bailey Tract was, no tall trees to speak of, no high trees. And when the rainy season came along the next time around, alligators actually found these blasted potholes and began to enhance them. So we had the start of permanent fresh water. This is the Sanibel Slough between the Gulf Beach Ridge, Sanibel Captiva Road. We're located, let me find out where we are. Here's Rabbit Road. We're somewhere right along in here. No, we're a little further up. I think maybe we're right there. So without the fresh water, what would happen when everything went dry in the slough, these little salt marsh mosquitoes that we have here would lay their eggs, and there would be trillions of salt marsh mosquito eggs on the bare bottom of this Sanibel Slough. When the rains came the following rainy season, the rising water table would hatch those eggs, and salt marsh mosquitoes would come off by the trillions. They would be unbearable on Sanibel during mosquito season. In fact, at the ferry landing, down by the lighthouse point, the state put up a light trap device, and in one dark period, from dusk until dawn, they trapped 365,000 salt marsh mosquitoes, a world's record. In 1974, that record was broken on Grand Cayman in the Cayman Islands. But we must note, just in passing, that when the Sanibel collection was made, in 1952, the light trap failed in the middle of the night. The bulb burned out. So it attracted the mosquitoes into the killing receptacle. So the Sanibel collection, I'm sure, would have probably exceeded 1 million mosquitoes had that not happened. Because you could literally go outside, when I lived at the lighthouse, and you could take your arm and just turn your arm bloody by wiping it. There were so many mosquitoes. I woke up one morning and one of the screens on the lee side of the house, opposite where the cistern was located, you couldn't see through it for the mosquitoes. It was just unbearable. So to combat mosquitoes, the Lee County Mosquito Control District was formed. And they did some pesticide spraying with DDT in the early years, trying to control mosquitoes. But then they came up with the concept of creating permanent fresh water. So what they did, they brought their drag lines, like you saw in the slide of Colin Moore, and they began to channelize the Sanibel River. You can see the piles of dirt. And they followed the lowest point of Sanibel and created what today is permanent fresh water, which is the famous Sanibel River. This is a natural part of the Sanibel River before it was channelized. So what happens when the water table raises in the summertime? The fish and the mosquito eggs hatch. The fish, little gambusia, little tiny inch-long fish, are carried along with the rising water, and as the mosquito eggs hatch, they gobble up the mosquito larvae, and it's sound biological mosquito control. It's dropped the mosquito population considerably. So today an aerial, this is from 1960, today an aerial photograph would show you just a maze of tributary canals that would go across these ridges into these swales and tied them all together. Before I leave this slide, this is Rabbit Road. This is West Rocks subdivision, brand new in 1960. Probably not a lot sold at that time. In 1963, my wife and I bought a lot in the West Rocks. We bought this lot right there. I'm kind of shaky. We paid $3,000 for it. And houses started to build, and I had to live at the lighthouse. It was a condition of my employment that I lived there, so I felt, oh, I'll never build a home there. So we kept it 3 years, and we sold it for $6,000 in 1966, and thought we'd made a whole bunch of money. Well, that lot stayed vacant until about 1999. In 1998, a gentleman bought it, and I happened to meet him one day, and I asked him what he paid for that lot. In November of 1998, he and his wife paid $105,500 for my lot. Now that is, without a doubt, a classic example of hindsight. In 1960, I could have bought a lot on the Gulf down near the ferry landing for $9,000. When Tommy Wood, the refuge manager, retired in about 1967, he owned a house at the very end of Woodring Point, a two-story home, and he offered that to me for $55,000, but I didn't buy it. Why? To this day, I don't know. Unfortunately, that house did burn down right after Gene Hackman made a movie there called Night Moves. So if you're into old movies made back in the 70s, try Night Moves, starring Gene Hackman, and I've forgotten, there's another famous actress that was here and played in it. And of course, the Sanibel Causeway, right after it was opened, probably before it was opened, I don't see any cars. There was very little traffic on the island after the first day. It was free. We drove across it the first day, went down to Bonita Springs to visit my wife's parents, and drove back, and it was free that day. I only recall one other time it was free during a hurricane. You could come back free. But it's been a money-making machine. Of course, we all know the controversies over the Causeway now. The Causeway is owned by Lee County. It's not owned by Sanibel. It's not controlled in any way by Sanibel. But we'll see what happens as this thing unfolds. I think we'll soon, within 3 or 4 years, have a brand new safe bridge. And I think that is the last slide. We'll take a brief intermission, and please stay and ask questions. Well, thank you very much. I'd be happy to entertain any questions. The gentleman just pointed out something to me, sort of an update on my sad tale about the West Rocks property. One of the lots in West Rocks just sold for $300,000. Yeah. Sanibel's a great investment. It's going nowhere but up. Until the hurricane comes, then it will go down. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
How did you cope with all those mosquitoes?
We, by the time I arrived here, the mosquito control program with chemical pesticides had brought some of them under control. But we would wear long-sleeve shirts. I would wear a mosquito netting, a beekeeper's outfit around my face to work outside. And I've never been one to use mosquito repellent. I just don't like the idea of chemicals, those kind of harsh chemicals. And I just suffered, wore gloves and long pants, and went out and did my duty.
That's just the breeding season?
Yeah, that's during the mosquitoes would come off periodically. They wouldn't come off constantly. There would be a high tide that would hatch them off in the mangroves, and then the flooding rains, a 4- 5-inch rain would hatch them off, and then 5 days after the rain, you'd have this peak mosquito arrival, and you'd have to cope with it. And, of course, a breeze in the summertime was always nice. It kept them down in the brush. But they did some studies on mosquitoes here in Lee County and found that Sanibel was the core problem for Lee County's mosquitoes. Mosquitoes that were radiated here on Sanibel were found 25 miles away on the mainland. So that's why Lee County Mosquito Control concentrated on Sanibel with their dragline program. There is a move now to alter some of the wetlands, to restore them to how they were before mosquito control ditching. It sounds good, but there are some ecological problems that I see that I'm not sure everyone notices yet, but I'm not ready to talk about them yet until I get ready to write a letter to the mailbag. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Have the no-see-ums always been the problem they are today?
Mosquitoes and no-see-ums have been probably co-equal partners in misery. The work that's being done for mosquitoes does not work on sandflies, or no-see-ums as they're called now. We have, I think, 5 different species of sandflies that are found on Sanibel, and all of them are really nuisances. There are no chemical agents that affect their nervous system like the nervous systems of mosquitoes. Mosquito repellents really don't work for them. The only thing that has any satisfactory assistance for sandflies other than staying in the wind is Avon Skin So Soft, which is a bath oil. And I'm not sure if it's the scent or the oil that keeps them off, but it appears to work. The best thing to do is not get afield in the early morning or in the evening when there's still wind, because that's when the sandflies come out. And they reproduce in the mangrove system and rotting vegetation. They don't reproduce in the water. And so when you get a high spring tide where the tidal water is higher than normal, all of this debris from the mangrove system and the seagrasses end up in the mangrove prop roots or the shoreline, and the sandflies reproduce. So it's best to stay away from the beach areas or the mangroves during sandfly periods and try to stay out in the breeze or stay in the air conditioning. I recall at the lighthouse, we had no air conditioning at the lighthouse the first 10 years I lived there. We did have window fans, but when the sandflies were bad on still nights, we couldn't stand it. We had to get the kids out up 3 o'clock in the morning in the car. We had no air conditioning in the car in those days. And we just roll the windows down and we'd drive up and down the island, the breeze, and the kids could get their night's rest. And, of course, the next day we'd be haggard, worn out, but it's the only thing we could do. Any other? Yes, sir.
When was electric power brought to the island?
The Rural Electrification Act, REA, brought power here to Sanibel, Pine Island, Marco, all about the same time, Everglades City, all about the same time in 1941. Before that, there were some generators. In some of the larger, like Causeway and Island End, had generators. Some of the more wealthy people that came here had generators.
It was brought on the island?
Brought on the island. There were small generators, similar to what we have for home use now. You could, of course, there was no television. You might want to listen to the radio or have a fan or electric lights to read by, but that's the only use. And in my book, Sanibel Light, I use an old expression about Sanibel before the Causeway. Let me see if I can remember what it is. Oh, yeah. On Sanibel, the shellers go to bed at 8, and the hellers go to bed at 9. That's an old Sanibel saying. Yes, sir.
Did you ever take that mail boat ride through Sanibel up to Kent?
No, I never did.
But you've been on the bay
Yes.
since you came to the island?
Yes. I mean, I ran a patrol boat for 32 years. I was here at Ding Darling Refuge 32 years. I retired in 1990. So as an enforcement officer, I patrolled all of the West Coast.
So you patrolled that before the now Causeway and the island
Mm-hmm.
installed. Do you notice any difference today in the levels and silting of Pine Island Sound and San Carlos Bay?
It's difficult to ascertain when you're constantly on the water. We get feedback now from fishing guys that tell us the bottom has changed. I really can't relate to that. I do know that some of the things that we used to do, just as a pastime, would be go oystering in Matlacha Pass, oystering in Tarpon Bay, occasionally scalloping at a place called White Rocks near Chino in Pine Island Sound. And all of those have changed. But they changed seasonally before the Causeway, too. Unfortunately, there is no baseline information that tells us what water depths were, only in the channels, because they were navigable channels and they were charted by the Coast and Geodetic Survey. There's very little biological data. There's some pseudo-studies that tell us what things were like, but some of those studies were biased studies. They were trying to get at an end result. So there is no, some of the old-time shelling guides like Bob Sabatino have good observational information on what it was like, but they're not really being heard. Some of the older fishermen, but most of the older fishermen that commercial fished here are gone, so we can't get any data. They've all either they've left the island or they've died. Sanibel is an unusual place in that the population, the average newcomer stays here only about 7 years. They either can't make it financially, some of the younger people, they die, or they move over to Shell Point Village. So we're constantly getting an influx of new people. We're constantly getting an influx of new people. And what do new people that come to Sanibel first thing they do? They try to change it just like it was back where they came from. And you can't do that on Sanibel. You really need to really get in the Sanibel mode. And many of these people that are spokesmen for Sanibel now have never been, never will be in the Sanibel mode, believe me.
As a follow-up, and I don't want to
Okay.
but this is the last part of that question. The Caloosahatchee River and its handling of the overflows of the Okeechobee, was that in place when you came here as it is now?
Yes, it was channelized. The Caloosahatchee was channelized by Diston way back in the early part of the century. I just heard something out here in the visitor center, a tape that was playing, and we talk about the overflow from Lake Okeechobee, how it was when there were oxbows in the river, and now it's channelized. The Caloosahatchee did not originate in the Caloosahatchee. It originated in a lake called Lake Flirt, which was, there was Okeechobee, Lake Hickpachee, and Lake Flirt. And the waters of the Caloosahatchee originated in Lake Flirt. Of course, there was some overflow. Okeechobee was a large basin. It just overflowed 360 degrees when it overflowed. Some came down to Hickpachee, to Lake Flirt, and then down the Caloosahatchee. And it meandered. But there's always been voluminous amounts of fresh water coming down the Caloosahatchee until 1960, 61. Every summer, you could look across, at certain periods, you could look across San Carlos Bay, and you would think, gee, I could walk across there. I could jump across there because of the enormous, large acreages of hyacinths that were coming down the Caloosahatchee. And then Lee County started a hyacinth control program, and hyacinths were killed at the origins up the Caloosahatchee, and they no longer come to the bay. But the sheet flow of rainwater that reaches the Caloosahatchee still comes to the Caloosahatchee. I don't know if I got off on a tangent or not, but...
Well, I'm just trying to understand the interplay of both of those.
Yeah, it's much different than it was geologically or historically before Diston channelized the Caloosahatchee. He went all the way to Okeechobee, and that's why there's locks. Before it was just can't think of a terrace-like effect. Okeechobee, Hickpachee, surrounding areas would flood, Lake Flirt, and then the Caloosahatchee came off of Lake Flirt and meandered in these large, graceful oxbows to the past Punarassa. Yes, sir.
Was there ever a commercial shrimping or oyster operation in the area here in the bay? Or
oysters were harvested seasonally in the wintertime. Matlacha Pass was a fine place for oysters.
commercially?
Commercially, oh yeah. But when we speak commercially, we're not talking about large scale. In 1910, 1920 at Marco Island, there was an enormous commercial clam fishery. From Marco south to Indian Key, there were bushels and thousands of bushels a day taken from the bottom there. And it was a commercial industry. And there is evidence of that commercial industry because the clamshells that were harvested are still visible, mounds of clamshells, where they weren't turned into roads by Mackle Brothers. It's just like going over to the Bahamas, and you go to some little Bahama village, and here's enormous piles of queen conchs that they've harvested. But go to Pine Island, where the oysters and the so-called scallop industry was located, and there is no evidence. The Indians, the Calusas, certainly left us evidence of shell harvesting, but there is no evidence of great commercial exploitation of those shellfish. I could go and get any day of the week and get enough oysters to eat, beautiful, delicious oysters. But I quit doing that about 1975 when threats of mercury levels and other pesticides were being picked up in the organisms.
What about shrimp?
There's still a shrimp fishery offshore. There's a fishery inshore, but it's all bait fish, bait shrimping. I mean, that's not to say you don't get edible shrimp in these drags. I mean, Ralph Woodring, who lives on Sanibel, bait shrimps in Tarpon Bay, and he gets nice edible shrimp. But most of the so-called pink shrimp are taken between Sanibel and Dry Tortugas, the pink shrimp, and it's a $1 million industry. There are still dozens of shrimp boats that work out of Fort Myers Beach. And you can see them at night, go out on the beach and look offshore. You'll see these lights on the horizon. They're commercial shrimp boats dragging the bottom. Yes?
Hi, when you were at the lighthouse and you were responsible for the refuge, which was still being called the Sanibel Wildlife Refuge, what did that entail for lands? It entailed the Bailey Tract?
Yes, we had the only thing that the Fish and Wildlife Service, when I came here, owned in fee title was the Bailey Tract, 100 acres. We managed a so-called 52-acre reservation at the lighthouse. Actually, it was only 26 because the rest had washed away. About 1961, 62, Dr. Louise Perry passed away, and she left us the Perry Tract on the Gulf Beach. And then the lands that we managed as part of the refuge were the mangrove, where we are now. The mangrove forest was owned by the state of Florida, either by the trustees of the Internal Improvement Fund or the school, the Division of Public Schools in Tallahassee. But we had agreements to manage those for wildlife purposes. After Ding Darling died in 67, when it was he died in 62, when it was renamed in 67, then the group called the Ding Darling Memorial Committee then pushed the Fish and Wildlife Service to acquire the state, school, and public lands. And the Fish and Wildlife started to do that and did some swapping for lands that up in North Florida, and all of the land we're now enjoying as part of the refuge was picked up and is now owned by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And slowly the refuge is growing, with an island being picked up here and picked up there. I want to interject one thing before we leave. I think one of the worst mistakes the Fish and Wildlife Service ever did on these islands was to give up the Sanibel Lighthouse Point. They gave it up, gave it back to the Bureau of Land Management as surplus, no longer needed for wildlife purposes, because the Sanibel Lighthouse was not compatible with the objectives of the Fish and Wildlife Service. To me, that's a sad commentary, especially now we left there in 82, so 21 years later, now refuges that have lighthouses, like St. Mark's Refuge, are spending thousands of dollars to restore those lighthouses as part of the message presented by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And that, to me, that's a sad commentary. Believe me, that could almost bring tears to my eyes when I see what's happening to the Sanibel Lighthouse through mismanagement. Yes, sir.
Was there any effort to obtain Ding Darling's fishing camp up there on Captiva?
I've been retired from the refuge almost 14 years now, and I know there were some gestures made. The land was sold to another family, and I think it's been resold a few more times, and I think there were some fingers put out to acquire it, and it was recommended by a group to acquire it, but I can't speak to what the status is now. It certainly would be a nice addition to the refuge.
Is it habitable now?
As far as I know, it's still lived in. I really can't answer that one specifically.
Where is that?
It's up on the bay side of Captiva, north of Buck Key. I believe you can go to the docks at Twin Waters Marina. No, Twin Palm Cottages, probably. Twin Palms Marina on Captiva. Go out to their dock and look off to the left, north, and you'll see a white house on pilings. That's Ding Darling's fish house. He built that as a retreat. He actually had a drawbridge. He could raise it up so he wouldn't be disturbed. Yes.
Other recollections in your experience with Ding Darling when you first arrived? I know they're in the book, but maybe
Yeah.
you'll share them.
Okay. I had the happy opportunity of meeting Ding Darling twice. The first time was in, I believe it was 1960. I was at the lighthouse. I was painting the base of the flagpole. And this car pulled in, and this elderly gentleman got out, got his cane, and started to go towards the stairs of the lighthouse. He turned around to me, and he said, hi there, you must be the new man. I was 21 years old and had no idea who he was. He walked over, he sort of hobbled over to me, he had a cane, and he said, I'm Ding Darling, shook my hand, and he said, Tommy told me you were coming to work here. This is like a year after I'd actually started. So he went up the stairs and went into the kitchen wing. Tommy still used his kitchen as kitchen. I used mine as a bedroom in my house. And they went in and had coffee, and soon Tommy invited me up to have a cup of coffee. So I sat there I knew who Ding Darling was only through the cartoon he did in 1948 when I was still in junior high school of the key deer. Do you all remember that cartoon of the key deer being driven off the keys by hunters and being clubbed in the water? I'm sure it's here in the visitor center somewhere. Take a look at it. That really impressed me. So I knew Ding Darling. I never saw his cartoons in the papers because I read Marmaduke and The Phantom and those kinds of cartoons, not political cartoons. So I had coffee with them, and we talked. We got on the subject of loggerhead turtles, and it was Tommy told Ding Darling how I was interested in loggerhead turtles, and we talked about things that could be done for loggerhead turtles on Sanibel. So that was a long-winded discussion. A few days later, Tommy told me he was going to do a biological survey of Pine Island Sound, and he wanted me to come along. We had a seaplane that was located in the Seaplane Canal at the Bailey Tract, and Tommy and I, with some suspicious-looking gunny sacks, burlap sacks, and some weird-looking poles with hooks on them, we threw those in the baggage compartment of the seaplane and took off from the Seaplane Canal just about daybreak and flew out over Pine Island Sound, and there were rafts of lesser scaup ducks, 10,000 birds in rafts, impressive. Tide was out. The flats were covered with egrets, herons, ibis, all sorts of shore birds. We basically did a species count of what we could see. And as the morning progressed, I knew this was just an excuse to make this an official trip, because we soon flew across Charlotte Harbor and went down to an immense bar near a long key, Bull Key near Turtle Bay on the north side of Charlotte Harbor. We landed the airplane, got a little anchor out, hooked it, and we commenced then to collect these enormous oysters. And we filled like 4 sacks, gunny sacks full of beautiful oysters, and we tied those to the struts on the floats. We take off. We go over to what is now Cabbage Key. It's a nice place to visit if you haven't visited it. And it's on top of a large Indian mound. We landed the plane, went up on this Indian mound. An artist lived there at the time. It wasn't a commercial type establishment like it is now. And we went inside, and it was cold as can be. We had coffee. We take off again. We're coming down Pine Island Sound, and all of a sudden, we bank over, and we land in behind, just north of Captiva Pass, behind Cayo Costa, the bar, grass flats, really exposed. So we put out a little anchor, walk up in the soft mud of the grass flat with each one of us with a pole with a metal rod coming out of it, in a hook that was bent like that and about that far apart. And we walked up on the flat, and I had never done anything like this before. I was used to taking oysters when I was a kid in Naples, but I had never done anything like this. So we walked up to this opening in the sand with a little mound of white sand in front of it. It looked like a wet gopher hole, a gopher tortoise hole. And you take this rod, and you'd put it down inside the hole, and you'd jab it around a little bit, and you'd hear something hard. Then you'd hear click, click, click. And you gently pull out the rod, and at the end of the rod was a giant stone crab. I mean, these were big stone crabs. So then he taught me how that you could take both claws, but he only took the large claw, no matter what the sex was. You could take both claws on males and one claw on females, but no matter what the sex was, he would put the females back and take only the crusher claw off the large claw off the males. And I don't know how many pounds of stone crabs we got that morning in a 5-gallon container, but it was a measurably large amount. So we came back, flew back to Sanibel, went back to the house after our official biological ascertainment of Pine Island Sound, and boiled up the stone crabs. And then the next day, in the afternoon, he said, come on, we're going to Captiva. So we jumped in this old Plymouth station wagon we had, and we took the oysters and the stone crabs up to Tween Waters, and Ding Darling and his wife were staying in one of the cottages. This would be his last trip to Captiva. He had actually left Captiva and just was feeling, he was staying in Clearwater, he was feeling good, so he came back to Captiva for one more time. That's the only reason I got to meet him. And we sat there drinking early times, eating oysters, and eating stone crabs for a couple of hours, and that's the last time I saw Ding Darling. Any questions? Yes, sir.
I worked on Monday 2 weeks ago. Gentleman from Des Moines came up to the desk, and he said he knew Ding Darling personally, but he said he wasn't a real great friend of his. But he said he had a copy of that cartoon that he drew that was his farewell cartoon that wasn't to be published until after his death.
Mm-hmm.
And we were chit-chatting there, and all of a sudden it comes up on our screen.
Isn't that something?
And he was very interested in well, he said he had seen that desk before.
Uh-huh.
And many of the things we have in the exhibit here.
Mm-hmm.
It was quite interesting.
Yeah, that's a nice way to pick up bits and pieces of information, especially if you can jog someone's memory and they can recollect those kinds of things. I was impressed. A few years back, my wife and I, well, after I retired, we went out, took a trip out west for like 3 months, and I went to for some reason, I ended up in Cody, Wyoming, and went to the Buffalo Bill Museum. Anybody ever been there? Isn't that fantastic? If you've never been there, go there. But I thought it was going to be some hokey exhibit, Buffalo Bill, but it is one of the greatest museums you'll ever have a chance to visit. And in there, in the art section, there's the original Ding Darling cartoon, I assume it's an original, of Buffalo Bill waving farewell. Really, really touching. Yes?
When you started Coretta, was there a lot of organizations or any along the Florida coast doing that?
The state of...
What got you started in that?
Right.
That's my basic question.
The state of Florida had I actually started sea turtles in '54 in Naples when I was just still in high school. I started doing things to enhance their survival. But when I came here the first summer I started working this beach was '59, and by then the state of Florida had started a Head Start program where they'd raise little turtles over at Stewart on the east coast of Florida. But there was no one else. Archie Carr did, some of his graduate students did some sea turtle tagging up around Cedar Keys in 1959, but there were no conservation efforts really being made to try to protect them or to learn more about them. So I started my program in May of '59, and I began tagging turtles in June of 1963. So ours was a pioneering program, and it's still an effective program. It's now managed by the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation. I no longer do any field work in sea turtles. I do get some consulting contracts now and then, but I don't do any active field work.
We must get a great satisfaction on seeing how it's spread up the coastline, up the states too, out of Florida, and how seemingly how
Yeah,
organized it is to monitor.
Yeah, it wasn't my doing that did that. I had a lot to do with what happened on the Gulf Coast because our program, by 1976, we had developed 14 units from Tampa Bay down to Cape Sable. So I have some personal satisfaction on that. But what happened, Archie Carr, the famous sea turtle biologist, published a couple of books for, the general population. One was The Windward Road. If you haven't read that, get it and read it. And the other is So Excellent a Fish. And So Excellent a Fish really brought sea turtle interest to a peak, and it's grown since then. In 1973, I hosted the first, what you would call a sea turtle symposium, and there were 6 people present. The Sea Turtle Symposium next month will be held in San Jose, Costa Rica, and they probably have 900 people worldwide that will be attending. So it's really sparked a lot of interest. And one of the main reasons is it's not only the scientist that works on sea turtles, it's the layman, it's the person that's interested in conservation that can actually do hands-on work with the adult turtles or with the eggs or with the hatchlings. It's a great deal of satisfaction. Reese is going to ask a question.
What's that clip thing?
Oh, my clip thing. This is a sea turtle tag. It's the only sea turtle gold sea turtle tag, as far as I know, ever made. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Reese knew what it was.
I see a plant.
No, not really. We were talking.
That, though, I don't know.
I just wear it as a the turtle. Yeah.
How does that work?
I'm not putting this on a turtle.
This,
it's actually a tag that opens up and it has a little turn on it, a little sharp point, and you put it over the turtle's flipper, and you, in a special pair of applicating pliers, and you force it through the turtle's flipper. The turtle is permanently marked with this flipper, unless the flipper is lost. And just to give you a little bit of information on the tagging program, turtles that we tagged on Sanibel have been found off of the Chandelier Islands in Mississippi, Louisiana, off of Cabo Cotoche around the southern end of the Yucatan Peninsula, off of the northeast coast of Cuba, Little Abaco in the Bahamas, Atlantic City in New Jersey, and up the Chesapeake Bay, York River in Virginia. Sanibel turtles that were tagged here, the turtles were recovered, drowned, killed, stranded dead on the beach, or observed in those points. An interesting aspect, in 1973, we tagged one turtle near the Lighthouse Point. She weighed close to 300 pounds. And that summer, we found that same turtle re-nesting 5 times. She nested 6 times in 1973. She deposited 920 eggs that summer. That's a record for, I think, for loggerhead turtles. I haven't seen in the literature where anyone, there have been 7 nestings documented, but I have not seen an egg count higher than the Sanibel egg count. But the most interesting thing, these turtles, the years that they nest, they multiple nest on about 11-night increments. Every 11 nights they re-nest. And that turtle in 1973, in those 6 nestings, she stayed within a 4-mile stretch of eastern Sanibel, and to me that's remarkable, how she did that. We don't understand how she did that, but just the fact that she did it. And you all must know what we named that turtle. Reese, do you remember? You heard the story before. That turtle was forever named Myrtle, the fertile sea turtle.
fertility.
Fertility.
Now, when you say that 4-mile stretch, and she did this every 2 weeks until she had the 7 nests or 8 nests, she just would go from one site to the next site?
No, she would randomly, she would not go to the same site. I mean, her nesting landings were just random, but within that 4-mile section of beach.
But she'd always go out to sea and come back?
Oh, yeah, she'd go back to sea. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, yeah.
Okay, that was my...
Yeah, she'd go back to sea, and she would have to compensate for currents and drift and wind, and yet she still returned within a 4-mile section. That's remarkable. You could see she'd get offshore, and a current would pick her up and carry her 20 miles up the coast, but she compensated for that and came back to basically the same spot. Yes, sir?
Has there ever been a program to monitor turtles by satellite so you can find their path?
Yes. Some of the university programs and some of the government programs now have satellite telemetry tracking turtles, and they're getting some interesting data. They're marking adult turtles with transmitters. There was, before satellites, there were no ways other than tagging to identify a turtle. We did some balloon work here years ago, and we would try to track them during that internesting interval, but many times the balloons were blown away, or the turtle got so far offshore we couldn't find them. But it is being done, and they're getting some interesting information on adult turtles. Their head start, Kemp's Ridley is a small sea turtle. It's the most endangered of all sea turtles, and they're head starting some in Texas. And I think when they release them at about a year, they're about the size of a dinner plate, and they're putting some small satellites on them. And now they're putting, on some of the turtles, they're putting what's called a pit tag. It's a small chip within the flipper so it can be picked up by a scanner to identify them. Any other questions? I thought I saw one more right here somewhere.
I want to ask, what kind of information do you put on
Okay.
the tags? Yeah.
Okay, this is a casting of the first in my series of tags. It's one side says CR 101. That means Coretta Research 101. First tag in the series, in that series. And the other side says Reward for Return, Coretta Research, Sanibel, FL. And so anyone finding this would mail it back, and we actually paid a $5 reward. Sometimes I got messages from shrimp boat captains off of Texas. Keep your damn reward, send a bottle of whiskey. Are there any other questions? Well, I want to thank you for coming this afternoon. We are going to, hopefully this will turn out, and I may put this on my website. Website again is www.sanibel.com. I have all of my books, and I have another videotape that I did at the Lighthouse Point. It's a walk on the Lighthouse Point. It's a lecture, on-scene lecture of beach ecology with a lot of the lighthouse and information, red tide, sea turtles, general things. Well, thank you so much for coming.